Thank you very much for this beautiful conference you gave, lecture you gave on the notion of autonomy. I have a first question concerning Tom Beauchamp, concerning the notion of autonomy. You were at the core of the decision at the time with the report of Belmont, 79. At the same time, there was also your famous book concerning the principles. Could you say us a little bit more about the birth of bioethics, the birth of autonomy, the birth of these principles?
Yeah, as to the birth of bioethics, it was actually a little bit before, but not all that much before. I date the birth of bioethics as roughly 1969. The reason for that is there had been several discussions that had cropped up just before 1969 that centered on certain problems in a number of areas. Death and dying was one of the areas. Research involving human subjects and so on. And in 1969, plans were laid for both the Hastings Center in New York and the Kennedy Institute at Georgetown. And then in 1970-71, those institutes came into existence, and they were the first institutes of bioethics anywhere. So it's a good period to date it to. Also, there were a number of developments in courts of law in the U.S., both pertaining to clinical ethics and sometimes research ethics. That I think is more or less the best dating point. The best dating point, though, for the beginnings of bioethics in terms of public awareness would be around 1972 because of some important cases that came down in that year in law, particularly pertaining to informed consent. So those were the early years. There were also an explosion of scandals in medicine that came down, the most famous of which is the Tuskegee studies that were done in Alabama with people of African American descent. That was clearly inappropriate kinds of medical experimentation. So all these issues were on the table around 1972. And then we had the National Commission that you're referencing with Belmont that came into existence through a congressionally mandated law in the United States. And the Congress mandated that the National Commission discover the basic principles of bioethics as well as what should be done to protect vulnerable subjects of research. That was the basic job of the National Commission. So the Belmont report was written specifically, it was called the Belmont paper at the time. We changed it later to the Belmont report once it was written. And it was basically to lay out what the basic principles, moral principles, are of experimentation. And the reason for finding them out is to say, what is the appropriate moral background for the development of federal guidelines in the United States, which then were developed, not only from these basic principles, but also from the other reports that the National Commission made on vulnerable populations. So that's the way I would situate it.
And how did you get involved in writing the principles at the same time with the Belmont? Because it's not very identical, both of them. Why is it not identical?
How I got involved, to take that question first, was that I received a call one day from the staff director of the National Commission, a lawyer named Michael Yesley, and he said, I would be interested in talking to you about a staff position with the National Commission. Would you be interested in talking to me about it? And I said, well, sure. What do I have to lose, right? So I went to see him in his office at the National Institutes of Health. And Yesley interviewed me about human research and all the things that the National Commission was going to get into. And then I went home, and he called me later that day and said, I'm going to offer this position to you. That's how I got involved, right? He didn't say anything to me about what I would be doing. He'd said a lot about what the National Commission is doing, but nothing about what I would be doing. The next day, the day after he hired me, he said, I'm going to assign to you the writing of something we call the Belmont paper. He said, it's a difficult assignment, and we don't have anybody else on the staff as yet was available, who can write this paper, so good luck. And I said, which principles do you have in mind? And he said, well, here's the preliminary discussion that we've had. And I said, well, what's the content of these principles to be? And he said, well, I think that's up to you. That's how I became involved.
Okay. And at the same time you were writing your principles, the famous book.
Yeah, the principles of biomedical ethics. That's right.
So how did it come that at a certain point with the Belmont report, there were 3 principles, and in your famous book on principles, there were 4 principles. Yeah. Why is it that you added another one?
Well, when I worked with the National Commission, I was working for a National Commission. So who's really in control of the final product is the National Commission, not me, the final product, right? So they wanted a number of changes in various formulations that I had made, and one of them was they did not want it to be respect for autonomy. They wanted it to be the principle of respect for persons, because they thought persons was the more basic category. I did not, because I thought it was less clear what you mean by respect for persons and what you mean by respect for autonomy. So we sort of agreed to disagree on that one.
So you think that the notion of respect for autonomy would be better fit for these cases for person in a situation of vulnerability?
Yes. Now, depends on the position of vulnerability, though, that you have in mind. If it's vulnerability where you have incompetence to consent, let's say, incompetence to actually perform an autonomous action, then respect for persons is a broader category and supposedly offers you protections. But what are the protections? Well, it's basically the protections that are afforded by a medical system as well as people who watch out for you in the context of the medical system. It could be your family, it could be somebody else. So that's why the National Commission wanted it, because they wanted it to be for all persons, vulnerable persons, not vulnerable persons who are involved in research, and so on. I didn't like that because I thought respect for autonomy was clear. It was for autonomous persons. And then the other principle of beneficence was one that covered the non-autonomous persons, meaning by that, beneficence required that they be provided with medical care. So I didn't think you needed the category of respect for persons. That was the idea.
Could you please tell us a little bit more about your conception about the notion of autonomy?
Right. I think it's reasonably clear, it's clear in my mind, what you mean by an autonomous action. It's an action that is intentional, so you have a conception and plan of the action, and you intend to perform it, right? And then there's understanding, that is to say you have to have a relevant understanding of the situation in order to be acting autonomously. So you need whatever the relevant information is for you in order to perform an autonomous act. And then you have to not be controlled. That is to say there can't be coercion on you, there can't be a very strong stimulus, like some kind of a manipulative stimulus that would take control out of your hands or whatever. So the simple idea is that autonomy consists of performing an intentional action with understanding of the nature and consequences of the action, and the action's not being controlled by another person or another set of conditions. Okay. That's the idea.
So is it possible for a physician to go against the autonomy of a subject? In the case, for example, of the Jehovah Witnesses.
Yeah. You mean the first? There's a question between whether it's first-party consent, that is, say, you're talking about the person who refuses treatment. You're talking about blood transfusions, who refuses the blood transfusions, or then third-party consent, which would be the parents who refuse it. It's absolutely possible for physicians to do both. However, it's now pretty widely agreed, this wasn't the case 50 years ago, but it's pretty widely agreed now in bioethics that it's inappropriate for a physician to overrule someone who refuses the transfusion, who's a competent adult and who refuses the treatment. So basically it's widely considered, I should say, unethical to do that. Now, when it comes to overriding parents who refuse for their children, who let's say they refuse for incompetent children, it's pretty widely agreed also that that's inappropriate on the part of the parents And it's perfectly appropriate for the physician, so to say, to override their autonomous refusal.
Okay. You mentioned also the question about the end of life. Could you say something more about the end of life and the notion of autonomy, right to die?
Right. Well, what we have right now is a discussion all over the world. Some countries being out in the lead on this discussion, the Netherlands being a very good example. And now many countries have come to the discussion, including the United States, including, of course, Switzerland. And it seems that a lot of different approaches are being taken in these countries. But the basic issue is whether or not, when a person has some kind of a health condition that they believe, they know, let's say, leads them to the decision that they want to end their life. So they want us to make a request to a physician to assist them in dying in whatever ways the dying might be assisted. So the basic moral idea is it appropriate for someone to make this request? Well, it seems really hard to say, no, it's not appropriate for you to make the request. But on the other hand, when you make this request, you involve others, the physician community, and so on, in some kind of assistance in your dying, because let's say you can't get the right pharmaceutical products by yourself to bring about the end of your life. So the fundamental question here is, how strong is your right of autonomy to make this request? And is it wrong of a country to restrict you from being able to go to a physician and make this request by its rules and regulations?
You mentioned also not only the physician, the possibility also the relationship with the family or with the community. Is that also something to take into consideration for when we have to make a decision of autonomy people, besides the fact of the end of life, but in general? Is it possible to think it through as a co-decision or as a co-autonomy, or it's not only the person decided himself? Is that the concept who is possible to?
Yeah. There's been a lot of discussion about that, particularly in the informed consent literature, for many, many years. It's generally not thought to be appropriate to think of a co-decision, in the respect in which you mean it, as being an autonomous decision, because the autonomous decision is really the individual decision, not a co-decision. However, here's one way to think about it. The informed consent process, the process, is basically one of mutual decision-making. It's your interaction with the physician coming to understand what you think is right and what you need, the kind of information you need. You're then discussing that information and how it feeds into what you think you want to do with that information and what kind of, where you want to go with it. And so the process slowly is getting to the point where the physician understands you, you understand the physician, and you now know from this what it is that you want to do or what you don't want to do. You want to refuse treatment. You want a more aggressive form of ending your life, for example, using pharmaceutical products or whatever. So the process itself can be one of collaborative discussion might be the better thing, right? But what actually happens at the end of the process is that you as an individual have to make a formal request, and you have to then authorize whatever is stated in that formal request.
Do you think that person in severe, vulnerable situation where the capacity of discernment is present, but is altered by social pressure, by the situation in which they are finding themselves, do you think in a certain way that they are capable of the same kind of autonomy that you and me do? If they are not, do you think that the community could help them in a certain way to make a decision who is their own decision?
Right. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the conditions that have to be satisfied is they have the intention to perform the act. So that's a significant level of cognitive activity by itself. They have the proper understanding of what they're doing in performing the act, and there aren't any threats or manipulative situations present at the time, such that you could say it's controlled by somebody else. If in fact that's the case with these vulnerable parties, then yes, of course they can. I mean, that obviously follows logically. The problem is that these conditions, particularly your capacity to resist being controlled by others or being controlled by the social situation, come by degrees. That is to say, more or less pressure can be exerted on you. You have more or less resistance to that pressure that's exerted. So it's really sort of impossible to address this question except in individual cases.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Yes.
Thank you very much.